You can tell a lot about a town by what it laughs at. Ours laughed at a man with 60 cents in his boot and a plan nobody asked for. We laughed the way scared people laugh, loud, quick, and looking sideways to make sure everybody else was laughing too. I laughed along with the rest of them that first week. God help me. And I've spent every year since trying to remember exactly what my face was doing when I did it. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about mockery. It's cheap when you buy it, and it costs everything when the bill comes due. I kept a ledger my whole life. Numbers in the left column, names in the right. I could tell you to the penny what any soul in Sable Wells owed me, and most of them paid slow. But there's no line in any ledger for the debt we ran up against that man, and I've never figured out the arithmetic to settle it. So I'm going to tell you what he did, and what we did to him while he did it, and you can do the sums yourself. Just don't laugh yet, that's all I ask. Wait until you've seen what he built, then laugh if you still can. The morning it started, I was scraping burnt grease off the flat top and cursing the drought like it could hear me. 3 years that drought had run. 3 years of a sky the color of an old bruise that never broke into rain. The Sabinal had gone to a string of green puddles, then to cracked mud, then to nothing but a memory with a name. Cattle that had been fat were bone. Men who had been proud were quiet. And me, I was down to serving thin coffee and thinner eggs to whoever still had a nickel, watching my town dry up one family at a time as they loaded trucks and drove east. I run the diner. Ran it, I should say. Adair's my late husband's name on the window, though he'd been gone 11 years by then and I'd stopped correcting the folks who called it Ruth's. 61 years old that summer, wide in the hip and short on patience, with a spiral notebook I kept under the register where I wrote things down. Not just debts. Things. Who came in crying, who left without eating, who lied about being fine. It's a habit, watching people and writing them down. My mother did it in a Bible, I do it in a ledger. Same church, different pew. I heard him before I saw him. Everybody did. It was the boots. Most men in Sable Wells walked soft by then, worn down, dragging. This man's boots hit the boardwalk like he had somewhere to be, and the ground had better keep up. Clock, 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 steady as a heartbeat. I looked up from the grease and watched him come down the middle of Main Street like he owned a road that could barely afford to own itself. He was a ruin of a man, and I mean that with respect. Tall but stooped in a way that wasn't age, more like he'd been carrying something so long his body had learned the shape of it. His hat had been good once, a decade or two back. Now the brim was soft as a dog's ear and the crown was dark with the sweat of 100 hard days. His coat hung off him. You could see where the man used to fill it. His face was burnt brown and cut deep, and he had a beard coming in gray and unplanned, and his eyes, I'll get to his eyes, because I wrote a whole paragraph about his eyes that night, and I've never crossed a word of it out. He had no horse. That was the first thing that made the men on the porch of the Mercantile go quiet. A cowboy with no horse is like a preacher with no God, technically still a man, but you wonder what happened. What he had was a canvas roll on his back, a coil of rope, a shovel worn down to half a blade, and a leather satchel he held against his ribs like it was breathing. He stopped in front of my window. Read the sign. Then he came in and the little bell over my door rang and every fork in that diner stopped moving. "Ma'am," he took the hat off. Under it his hair was matted flat and going gray, and there was a pale band on his forehead where the sun never reached. "I don't have money for a meal. I was hoping I might trade work for one." Now I'd heard that 100 times that year. Drifters mostly. Men the drought had shaken loose from other towns, blowing through hours like tumbleweed with a sad story. I'd fed some, turned away more. You have to, or you go under with them. But something about the way he stood there, hat in both hands, chin level, not begging, just stating a fact and letting me decide what to do with it, made me point my spatula at the corner booth instead of the door. "Sit," I said. "You can wash the pots after, deal." "Deal," he almost smiled. His mouth wasn't sure it remembered how. "Obliged." I fried him 2 eggs and the last of the ham I'd been saving and put it in front of him, and I watched him eat. That's when I knew he was different. He didn't wolf it. A starving man wolfs it. I'd seen a dozen do it that spring, hunched over the plate like a dog guarding a bone. This man ate slow, careful, like he was honoring the food. Like somewhere along the way he'd learned that gratitude is a discipline you keep even when your stomach is screaming at you to forget it. Halfway through, he set down his fork and looked out the window at the empty street and the brown hills past it. "You folks are dying out here," he said, not unkind, just true. "We're managing," I lied. He looked at me then, and I met those eyes for the first time. They were the palest gray I've ever seen on a living person, like river ice, and they had a stillness in them that wasn't peace. It was the stillness of a man who has already survived the worst thing that will ever happen to him, and is just waiting to find out what he's supposed to do with the leftover life. "No," he said, "you're not, but you could." He didn't say more than that. Not that day. He washed my pots, did a better job than my last 3 hired boys, and then he walked back out into the heat and disappeared past the edge of town, out toward the Halloran place. Now I have to tell you about the Halloran place, because you can't understand what came next without it. Old Ezra Halloran had homesteaded the worst quarter section in the county. Everybody knew it. It sat in a low bowl of ground north of town, ringed by caliche hills, and it had never been good for anything. Halloran had dug a well there back in the 80s and hit water, but the water had gone alkaline and then gone away, and the windmill he'd built to pull it up had thrown a blade in a windstorm and stood crooked and dead for 30 years. Halloran died broke. His kids never came back. The land reverted to the county for taxes nobody would pay, and it just sat there, a collapsed soddy, a dead well, a broken mill, and about 40 acres of cracked hardpan that not even the mesquite wanted. We called it the boneyard. Kids dared each other to spend the night out there. That was all it was good for, fear and dares. And that, we learned the next morning, was where the stranger had gone. Del Crawford brought the news into the diner with his coffee still steaming. Del ran the mercantile and knew everything worth knowing and a great deal that wasn't. "That drifter," he said loud so the whole room could get in on it. "You know where he's at? Out at the boneyard, camped in the old soddy, and you'll never guess what he told me when he come in for supplies this morning." "He had money for supplies," I said. "Traded his rope for a sack of beans and a box of nails. But listen." Del leaned in, delighted with himself. "He says he's going to fix the well, get the water back, rebuild the mill, says he's going to make the boneyard bloom." Del slapped the counter and laughed his big wet laugh. "By himself. No horse, no crew, no money, one man and a busted shovel is going to do what the whole county couldn't. The boneyard." And the diner laughed. Lord, we laughed. It felt so good to laugh. You have to understand what that year had done to us. We'd been so frightened for so long, watching the sky and the bank calendar, that we'd forgotten what it was like to feel bigger than something. And here was this ruin of a man, this horseless, penniless drifter, handing us something smaller than ourselves. Of course we grabbed it with both hands. I laughed too. I want to be honest about that, because the whole point of me telling you this is honesty. I stood behind my own counter and I laughed at a man who'd washed my pots for 2 eggs, and I felt lighter for it, and I didn't feel one bit ashamed until I did. That night I wrote in my ledger, "Drifter at the boneyard. Claims he'll bring water. Whole town thinks it's the funniest thing since the preacher's toupee blew off in church." And then, underneath, because I always write the true thing under the funny thing, I wrote, "But he ate slow. Men who have given up don't eat slow." He worked. That was the part nobody expected, and the part that, day by day, killed the laughing. Every morning that first week, somebody would drive out to the boneyard just to look. It became a kind of entertainment. You take the family in the truck after supper, park up on the caliche ridge and watch the crazy man dig. And every time there he was, not resting, not gone, digging. He'd cleared the collapse out of the old well first, hauled up bucket after bucket of fallen rock and dirt on a rope rig he'd built from mesquite and salvage, working a windlass he'd knocked together out of the wreck of the old mill. The men on the ridge would call things down to him. Cruel things, some of them. Clever things, they thought. He never answered. He'd stop, look up at the trucks, touch 2 fingers to the brim of that soft old hat like he was thanking them for coming, which somehow made it worse for the mockers, because you can't get a rise out of a man who treats your insult like a visit. And then he'd go back to work. I didn't go out there that first week. I told myself I was too busy. The truth was that I'd laughed, and I didn't want to see up close what I'd laughed at. But on the 8th day, Charlie Pruitt's boy Sam came into the diner white as a sheet and said, "Miss Ruth, you gotta come see. The crazy man. He's hurt bad and he won't stop." So I closed the diner in the middle of the lunch rush, which I had not done since the day I buried my husband, and I drove out to the boneyard. The well had gone down deep, 30, 40 feet, timbered as he went with lumber pulled from the dead soddy. And the stranger was down in the bottom of it, and I could hear him working, and the reason Sam had come running was the blood. He'd cut his hand, bad, on something down there, a shard of the old casing I found out later. It had opened his palm from the base of his thumb clear across, and he'd wrapped it in a strip torn off his own shirt, and the strip was soaked through dark, and he was still swinging the pick, one-handed, down in the dark, because the man had gotten a feel of damp in the soil and he wasn't about to stop for a little thing like his own blood. "Hey," I shouted down. My voice bounced around that shaft and came back at me. "Hey, you come up here right now, you damn fool." The digging stopped. After a moment his face turned up to me out of the dark, pale in a pale ring of daylight, and those river ice eyes found mine. "There's water," he said. His voice was hoarse and wondering, like a man reporting a miracle he wasn't sure he was allowed to have. "Ma'am, there's water down here. I can feel it in the ground. There's blood down there is what there is. You come up before you bleed out at the bottom of a hole, and I have to explain it to the sheriff." He came up, not because he was scared. I don't think that man had a nerve left that fear could reach. But I think because a woman was telling him to, and somewhere in the wreckage of him, there was still a piece raised to mind his elders and his womenfolk. He came up hand over hand on that rope with his cut palm leaving red prints on the fibers, and when he got to the top and stood in front of me in the hard sun, I got my first good look at what a week had done to him. He was ruined. His hands were split and blistered. His face had gone gaunter, if that was possible. He swayed on his feet, and under the exhaustion and the blood and the dirt, there was a light in him so fierce it frightened me, the light of a man who has found the one thing left in the world he is willing to die doing. I sat him down on a rock and unwrapped his hand, and near about fainted at the state of it. I'd brought a first aid tin from the diner, more out of habit than sense, and I cleaned that cut and butterflied it shut with tape while he watched me work with those calm gray eyes. "You're going to lose the use of this hand," I told him. "You keep on like this. Then I'll dig with the other one." "Why?" I burst out, and I heard my own voice crack, and I was ashamed of it because I'd meant to be stern and instead I sounded like I was pleading. "Why in God's name are you killing yourself for 40 acres of hardpan that nobody wants? You don't even own it. You don't know a soul in this town. We laughed at you, every one of us. Why?" And he looked at me for a long moment. And then he looked past me, out over the boneyard, at the crooked dead mill and the cracked ground and the low brown bowl of ruined land. And I swear to you, something moved across his face that I had no name for. "Because somebody has to," he said quietly, "and I'm the one that's here." That should have been the end of the mockery. It wasn't. People don't give up a good laugh just because it stopped being funny. They hold on harder, because letting go means admitting they were wrong to have started. Del Crawford took it worst. Maybe because the stranger's supplies were coming out of Del's own stock, traded for whatever the man could offer, his coil of rope, his spare shirt, the good knife off his belt. Piece by piece, the stranger was selling himself down to nothing to buy nails and beans and lamp oil, and something about watching a man do that made Dell mean instead of merciful. "He's a lunatic," Dell announced in my diner more than once. "Or a con. Nobody works like that for nothing. He's after something, you watch. He'll dig his hole and then he'll want the county to pay him for it, or he'll squat on that land and claim it, or worse. A man that's got nothing to lose is a dangerous man." Dell tapped his temple. "Mark it down in your book, Ruth," I called it. I marked it down. I marked down exactly what Dell said. And then under it, because I always write the true thing under the said thing, I wrote, "Dell's scared. Not of the stranger. Of the idea that a man with nothing can do a thing that men with everything gave up on. That's a thing that shames you if you let it." Word got around about the water he'd felt. The town split the way towns do. Some folks started to soften, took to leaving things out at the Boneyard Road, quiet at night. A sack of cornmeal here, a worn-out saddle blanket, a jar of liniment for his hands, left by old Nettie Vance, who'd never left a kind word for anybody in her life but knew ruined hands when she heard about them. Nobody signed their gifts. Nobody wanted to be caught believing in him yet. But the gifts came. And some folks got harder. Dell's crowd. The men who'd been laughing loudest, who had the most laughter to lose. They started to talk about the stranger the way frightened men talk, about how somebody ought to do something, about a squatter on county land, about how you couldn't just let any drifter dig holes wherever he pleased. I felt the town leaning. I couldn't tell which way it would tip. I've thought since that a town in a drought is like that dead well, full of dark and pressure and something buried, and you never know if what comes up is going to be water or poison until you crack it open. The night it nearly broke was the night of the fire. I don't know for certain who said it. I have my ideas. I've had 30 years to have my ideas, and I've never once written a name in my ledger next to the word fire, because the difference between what I believe and what I can prove is the only thing that ever kept me an honest woman. But somebody rode out to the boneyard in the dark, and somebody put a torch to the old soddy where the stranger slept, and to the fresh-cut timber he'd stacked for shoring the well. I woke to the glow of it against my ceiling. Half the town did. We came out into the street in our nightclothes and stood watching the orange light climb up over the Caliche Ridge, and I remember the terrible silence of it, nobody saying the thing everybody was thinking, which was, did we do this? Did our laughing do this? Is a man burning to death out there because we needed someone to feel bigger than? I got in my truck. I don't rightly know why. An old woman in her housecoat has no business driving toward a fire. But I drove, and half a dozen trucks fell in behind me, the softening ones, the gift levers, the ones the shame had reached, and we tore out to the boneyard in a line of headlights and dust. And what we found there, I have carried in me every day since. The soddy was gone, a heap of smoke and cinder. The timber stack was a bonfire throwing sparks up into a black and rainless sky, and the stranger wasn't running. He wasn't beating at the flames, wasn't standing frozen, wasn't cursing us or crying. The stranger was at his windlass, hauling up bucket after bucket of the little brackish water he'd found, and throwing it not on the soddy, not on his own burning shelter, not on the timber that was his whole labor going up in smoke. He was throwing it on the mill. On the crooked, dead, 30-year broken windmill. He was soaking the base of it, the one thing out there that had already been ruined before he ever came, protecting it from the sparks with the last of his strength, because I understood it later. That night I didn't understand it at all. I just stood there in my housecoat in the firelight and watched a burnt, bleeding, half-dead man let his own bed and his own labor burn to the ground to save a broken thing that couldn't even help him, and I heard myself make a sound I'd never made before. He turned when the trucks came. His face in the fire was black with soot and streaked where the sweat had run through it, and he looked at all of us, at me, at the crowd of us who'd come too late and done too little and laughed too long, and he didn't say a word of blame. He just held up the empty bucket, and he said in that hoarse, wrung-out voice, "Well, anybody feel like helping now that you're here?" Nobody helped that night, not at first. We stood there. Then old Nettie Vance, 79 years old, the meanest tongue in 3 counties, the woman who'd left the liniment. Nettie Vance climbed down out of her grandson's truck, marched past all of us in her nightgown and her rubber boots, took the empty bucket out of the stranger's hand and said, "Move over, you stubborn goat. You're spilling half of it." And that broke us open. I don't know how else to say it. One old woman with a bucket and something that had been dammed up in the whole town for 3 dry years let go all at once. Men who'd been laughing a week before were suddenly running the bucket line. Somebody's boy beat out the sparks around the mill's base with a saddle blanket. Charlie Prout backed his truck up and we soaked blankets in the stock tank and threw them over the timber to save what wasn't burnt through. Nobody gave an order. Nobody needed to. For the first time in 3 years, Sable Wells did something together. And what we did was try to undo, with our hands, a cruelty we'd let grow in our mouths. We didn't save the soddy. We didn't save more than half the timber. But we saved the mill. That crooked, dead, 30-year broken windmill, we saved it, because the stranger had shown us it mattered before any of us knew why. When it was over, we stood around in the gray coming up of dawn, 40 of us, sooty and coughing and not looking at each other. And the stranger stood in the middle of us, swaying, and I thought he was going to fall. He didn't. He looked around at us all and then up at the mill, black with smoke but standing. "That mill," he said, quiet so we had to hush to hear him, "is the only thing out here that was already broken before I came. Everything else I can build again. But you can't build a broken thing new. You have to fix the broken thing or you don't have anything at all. That's the whole job. That's the only job there is." And I wrote that down. I wrote it down that same morning, sitting in my truck with the sun coming up, my hands still black. You have to fix the broken thing or you don't have anything at all. I didn't fully know yet that he wasn't talking about a windmill. After the fire, the town changed. And I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a lesser story would go all warm and easy, and it wasn't warm and it wasn't easy. Some folks helped. Not all. Del Crawford never lifted a hand, and there was a hardness in Del after that night that never did heal, the particular hardness of a man who suspects he's guilty of something too large to look at. But the softening ones came all the way over. Charlie Prout sent his boys out with a wagon of fresh-cut lumber and wouldn't hear a word about pay. The Vance grandson brought a mule. Nettie brought food and stayed to argue with the stranger about how he was doing everything wrong, which I came to understand was the only language of love the old woman had ever learned to speak. But here's the thing, and this is the part I've never been able to make people believe. The stranger wouldn't let us build it for him. He let us help. He'd take a hand hauling timber, a loan of a mule, a meal. But when it came to the well and the mill, the real work, the heart of it, he did that alone, and he was gentle but immovable about it, and it frustrated the very kindness out of us. "Let us dig it out for you," Charlie Prout said. "You got 20 men here'd swing a pick. We'd have your water in a week." And the stranger shook his head. "It has to be mine," he said. "Not because I'm proud, because of what it's for." And he wouldn't say more, and we didn't understand, and some of us got hurt about it, the way you get hurt when your kindness is refused. I understood it before the others did, maybe because I'd been watching him longest in my quiet ledger-keeping way. I understood that the man was not building a well. The well was just the shape the thing was taking. He was building something to lay down a weight he'd been carrying so long his back had grown around it, and a weight like that, you can't have other men carry it for you. It doesn't count if they do. So we let him. We helped where he let us and we watched where he wouldn't. And all through that brutal summer the stranger went down into the earth day after day, one cut hand and then two, and dug toward the water he swore was there. He hid it in September. I was there. Half the town was there by then. It had become a thing we did, driving out to watch him work, except now we watch the way you watch someone you love do something dangerous, not the way you watch a fool. We were up on the Caliche Ridge in the long gold evening light when he came up out of the well shaft, moving different than usual, faster, wrong-footed, and my heart went to my throat because I thought he'd hurt himself again. Then he got to the top and he was holding up his cupped hands, and even from the ridge you could see they were full of something that caught the light. Water, clear water, sweet water, not the brackish trickle he'd found in the spring. He'd dug past that, through it, deeper than any man had ever dug on the Halloran place, down to a vein of cold, clean water that nobody in the county had believed still existed under our dying land. I've heard grown men cheer at a lot of things in my life. Ball games, weddings, the end of wars. I never heard anything like the sound that went up off that ridge when the stranger held up his hands full of clean water. It wasn't a cheer. It was something older than cheering. It was the sound people make when the world gives back something they'd stopped letting themselves hope for. He didn't cheer. He knelt down at the mouth of the well in front of all of us, and he lowered his head over his cupped hands and his shoulders shook, and I understood I was watching a man weep who had probably not let himself weep in years. Then he did a thing I'll never forget. He didn't drink first. He carried that first double handful of water up the slope, to where the oldest person on the ridge was standing, which was Nettie Vance, and he held it out to her. "You had faith first," he said. "You get the first drink." And that terrible old woman, who'd never in her life admitted to being moved by anything, put her wrinkled hands under his ruined ones and drank the first clean water out of the boneyard. And then she looked up at him with her eyes streaming and said the only tender thing I ever heard cross her lips. "You blessed fool." Now the well was one thing, the mill was another, and the mill is where I learned who he was. He rebuilt that windmill through the fall, trued the tower, cast a new blade, fixed the pump rod, and did it slow and exact, because a windmill has to be right or it tears itself apart in the first hard wind. And the day he raised the new blade and let the west wind take it, and it began to turn, that slow, groaning, gathering turn, and the pump rod started to stroke, and the pipe began to gurgle, and then to pour, clean cold water out onto the cracked dead ground of the boneyard. Half the town was there for it, and we watched water run across ground that hadn't been wet in 30 years, and we watched it find the old irrigation cuts Ezra Halloran had scratched into that dirt a lifetime ago, and we watched it go down into the low bowl of the land, spreading, soaking, turning gray dust dark. And every one of us, I think, understood in that moment what the man had seen from the very first day that we'd all been too small to see, that the boneyard wasn't dead. It was just thirsty, same as us. That evening, after the crowd thinned, I stayed. I brought him a plate from the diner, real food, a good cut of beef, the first he'd had in months, and I sat with him on a good new bench he'd built by the well, and we watched the mill turn against the sunset, and I finally asked him the question I'd been carrying since spring. "You never told me your name." He was quiet a while, the mill creaked, the water ran. "Halloran," he said. "Ezra Halloran was my father." I didn't say anything. I've learned that the kindest thing you can do when a man decides to set down a weight is to hold still and let him. "I grew up out here," he said, "on this land, when it was good, and it was good for a while before the water turned. My father broke his body on this place trying to make it live, and it wouldn't, and it turned him bitter, and it turned him hard, and he took the hardness out on us, on my mother, on me. He turned the tin cup slowly in his ruined hands. I ran off at 17, told him this land was a grave and he was a fool for digging in it and I'd never come back. Those were the last words I said to my father. You're a fool and this land's a grave." He was quiet. He died alone out here 5 years later. The bank took it. I heard about it in a bunkhouse in Wyoming, a year after the fact, from a man who didn't even know he was telling me about my own father. The mill turned, the water ran, the light went red and then gray. "I spent 40 years telling myself he was the fool," Halloran said, "that the land was the grave, and then I got old and I got sick." He said it plain, the way he said everything, and I felt the bottom drop out of me, and I found out I don't have a lot of road left. And a man with no road left starts to think about the words he can't take back, and I realized. He stopped, started again. I realized the only way to tell my father he wasn't a fool was to prove the land wasn't a grave. That's the only apology he'd have understood. Not words. Water. He looked at me with those river ice eyes, calm as ever, and for the first time I saw all the way to the bottom of the man. "So I came home to fix the broken thing," he said. "Because you have to fix the broken thing or you don't have anything at all." He gave it away, all of it. That was the last shock and the one that finished breaking Del Crawford, who'd sworn the man was a con after money. Halloran filed no claim, took no title. He walked into the county office with me as his witness, and he deeded the boneyard, the well, the mill, the water, the good green start of the land to the town, to Sable Wells, in trust for anybody who needed it. A widow with a dry garden, a rancher with dying stock, anybody. Free water forever in the middle of a 3-year drought, from a man who'd sold his own knife to buy the nails. "Why?" Del demanded. I was there. I heard it. Del standing in the county office, red-faced and lost, unable to make the man fit into any shape Del had a name for. "What do you get out of it? What's the angle? Nobody does this. What do you get?" And Halloran looked at him, not unkind, and he said, "I get to have been the kind of man who did it." And he touched 2 fingers to the brim of that soft old hat, and he walked out. He died the following spring. The sickness he'd named so plainly caught up with him the way he'd known it would. He'd stayed the winter in a little room I fixed up for him behind the diner. He'd earned it 100 times over, and I was past pretending I wasn't glad of the company. He got thinner and grayer and slower, and he never once complained. And near the end, when he couldn't get out to the boneyard anymore, I'd drive him out and we'd sit and watch the mill turn and the green spread, wider every week, over ground the whole county had left for dead. The last clear day he had, we sat out there and the wind was good and the mill was turning strong and the water was running, and there was a green haze of new grass all across the low bowl of the boneyard, real grass growing. "It's not a grave," he said, quiet, wondering, like he was telling it to somebody who wasn't me. "Look at it, Pa, it was never a grave." I held his hand, the one with the long white scar across the palm, and I didn't say anything. I just held still and let him set it down. We buried him out there. The town voted on it, unanimous, even Del. We put him on the little rise above the well where he could catch the sound of the mill, and the whole of Sable Wells came, and Nettie Vance, who buried him 10 months before she went herself, stood at the grave and said, "You blessed fool," which was the finest eulogy anybody in that town ever got. The mill's still turning. I go out most evenings, even now, even old as I've gotten. The boneyard's not the boneyard anymore. We don't even call it that. The children call it the green, because they've never known it any other way, and they can't imagine that a whole town once drove out here to laugh at a dying man for saying this dust could live. I still keep my ledger. Numbers on the left, names on the right. And there's one account in it I've never been able to close, one debt I've never made the sums come out even on, no matter how many years I've worked at it. I laughed at him. That first week, behind my own counter, I laughed. And he washed my pots and dug my town a well and gave it all away and never once, not one single time, held that laugh against me. You can't pay a debt like that. I've decided the only thing you can do is what he did. Find the broken thing and fix it, because that's the whole job. That's the only job there is. The wind's coming up now. The blade's catching it. Any second the water's going to start to run, the way it has every day for 30 years, out across ground a whole town swore was dead.